Hello. So today we're doing another session in our Baselight learning program. So today I'm going to talk about BaseGrade. And yeah, there's a lot of things I want to show. Probably the session will be a little bit longer than usual. And my colleague Bob is again with me to answer questions. There's not much else I need to say. I guess we can get started already. So today we will talk about BaseGrade, one of the key grading operators inside Baselight. Let's start with a quick overview here of the user interface. Here on the top we can see 3 color wheels and they're labeled dim, balance, light. There's a second page, dark, balance, bright. What you can already notice is that balance remains in both pages here in the center because it's the most important tool. And here on the bottom we have other parameters like flare, contrast, saturation and pivot points. The relationship between the UI and the panel is always the same in Baselight. Always the parameter here on the left is mapped to the left ring and trackball and the one on the right to the right ring and trackball, etc. And the parameters here on the bottom are mapped to the encoders on your grading panel. And all of these parameters can be adjusted dynamically, which then also updates the panel mapping. The most important parameter inside BaseGrade is balance. Balance adjusts the exposure and white balance of images. And I would even go so far to say that balance is the most important tool inside the whole Baselight software. And so it is really the bread and butter of colorists. Therefore, we will spend a lot of time today looking at the balance parameter, and we will have a look at the other parameters after that. Okay, so let's start playing with that shot here. We can correct the exposure here with the balance parameter. The unit that we're correcting here are t-stops. So these are photographic stops, and a stop is always halving and doubling the amount of light. So that's a very handy way of communicating, for example, with DPs who also work in stops on the set when they light a scene and when they expose the camera. And when we move the trackball here, we can correct the white balance of the shot. Notice here how the image turns very blue when I correct it in that direction, and it goes very warm and I go into the other opposite direction. And one thing to look out for, and that is a little bit special about BaseGrade, is that it's a physically based tool. So it tries to mimic the actual physics of light. So pay attention here to the colors on the image, especially the dark regions. They stay neutral in their color even when I'm doing these strong corrections. That because in the real world something that is black cannot have a certain color, so it needs to have a certain amount of light to have a specific color. And so this relationship between brightness and color is built into BaseGrade, and that's what gives it its very physically plausible response that people like. So when we put new shots into a timeline and start grading from scratch, first adjusting the balance, exposure and white balance, that's a very good starting point from my point of view. Okay, what have I prepared here? So here on the top I have the same raw clip, but this time with a different ISO exposure. So here I decoded it at 12,800, and on the bottom I decoded it at 800. So let's now try to correct the overexposed shot to match the other shot. So how many stops do we need to correct? 12.8, 6.4 is one stop, 3.2 is the second stop, 1600 third stop, and 800. So these are 4 stops that we need to correct. And instead of doing it here in the raw decoding settings, I can also do the same thing in BaseGrade. So I go into balance, and because the range is limited to plus and minus 3 stops. In the normal range, I need to activate extended ranges, and I can type in -4. So now we corrected that shot down here by 4 stops. Let's compare it to our reference, and we can see this is a perfect match. So that means we can do the exact same corrections that we can do in the raw decoding settings. We can match them in BaseGrade. And this is great because first we have control over it on the panel. So we have a really convenient trackball and ring control over the exposure and white balance. And secondly, we don't need raw shots to do these kind of corrections. We can apply the same corrections also to, for example, ProRes material where we don't have access to the raw parameters. Okay, let's move on to the next shot. So here we have a slight color cast on the image. It looks a little bit yellowish, uncorrected. And we want to balance that. So because I don't have an actual panel connected, which is always the most convenient way to adjust the white balance from my point of view, I will use another tool here, and that's the pick and match feature in BaseGrade. The pick and match is a semi-automatic way to drive the balance control. So it only drives the balance, it doesn't do anything else. So that's an important thing to know. And because balance is such a minimalistic and non-destructive operation, it's ideal to do these initial neutralizing grades. So with match, I can select a region in the image, and it will then be matched to our reference patch here. And the default reference patch is 18% middle gray. So I can pick something here in the image, for example, that grayish terrain surface, and now it matched the overall color balance and the exposure to match that patch here. If I don't want to modify the exposure, I can reset that part of the correction, and so now we can see only the color balance being applied to the image. So the only thing that we need to make that work is a gray or white surface that should be neutral in color. So if I go to that gray building here in the background that has a really strong blue bounce from the sky, we can see, so now we neutralized that area here, but which makes the foreground now very yellowish. So let's set that back here to the foreground and move on to the next shot. Here we see a greenish cast on the image, probably introduced by the light sources. So let's try to correct that out with a BaseGrade. And what we can try is using the a whitish light here to neutralize it. And so I'm now picking here in that bright area. It makes the image quite dark, so let's reset that. And we can also see it did not really neutralize the greenish color. And the problem is that this part of the frame here was clipped, so not all of the 3 color channels did hold enough color information here. But what I can do is try balancing here on these unclipped areas. And now resetting the exposure. And so now we can see we got that greenish color cast corrected out of the image. And one thing I always want to point out with BaseGrade is how clean it works. Notice that the black stays neutral in color, and also on other shots the highlights. So typical things that we need to do with other grading operators, like cleaning the shadows and highlights after doing heavy lifting in color balance, should not be necessary with BaseGrade. Let's move on. So here we have a very extreme example with extremely greenish lighting, but we have something that should be neutral in color, maybe here that white piece on the costume. So what I do is I just pick here, because it makes it gray, the image turns too dark, so I can correct it brighter. Let's home zoom. And again, please notice how even in that super extreme case, going from here to here, how clean BaseGrade works, and just with a single parameter, it can correct out that extreme greenish color cast. But we can not only use the middle gray reference value in here. What you can also do is you can do a right click on the color reference patch, and then we can pick a color here from 3 presets. And here we have the Macbeth chart built in as a preset. So what we could do is here, for example, select that grayish patch and then select the same patch here in the image. And then we can see it will correct white balance and exposure to match that patch. And it gives us a nice starting point to continue with our grade then. Now move on to the pick feature. So first let's do a correction on that image here. I might do it a little bit brighter and also maybe a little bit warmer first to have a nicer skin tone. And now let's have a look at the next shot. So this is the same actress but in a very different lighting condition compared to that shot. So here she's hit by a very strong green key light from one direction, and here that green light is not present. So let's say we want to match that green shot here to this shot. And what we can do is, instead of using that neutral gray or a preset from the patches, we can use the pick feature and now go into the image and select something like her skin tone here on her cheek. And so now that skin color is now stored in that reference patch. So the pick feature does not alter the image at all. It just stores the reference color in that patch. And all BaseGrade operators share that same reference patch all the time. So now that we stored it in here, we just need to move to the next shot, also add a BaseGrade, and notice that it's already automatically set to match. After using pick, now we can select a similar area and it matches now this color here to that reference color. If you look closely, you will notice that in the shadow areas it now has a tendency going towards magenta, but that's logical because the tool doesn't do any kind of magic. Look at the uncorrected shot, we can see that the green key light is hitting just from one area, but the ambient light in the room is not green. So here we have less green in the shadow areas. That means if we correct out the green from the key light, we will see a little bit more magenta in the shadows. So it's not like a magical problem solver for all cases, but still a very powerful tool. And it's very easy to adjust what it did here. So we can still correct the exposure to our liking. And also if we're not happy with the color correction of the pick and match, we can then still also touch these controls and modify them further, of course. On this shot here, we can see again a slightly greenish yellowish color cast. So what are we doing here? So first I would probably correct it a little bit darker. And then the question is, what is the neutral color here? So I reset this here to middle gray, because we could balance, for example, here on that area, but we could also balance on that area here, and we can see that it gives a very different color. So if we balance here where there's more greenish or bluish bounds, it gives us a warmer global image, and if we do the same thing here, it gives us a little bit more colder image. And one thing that we could try on a shot like this is here in that example, just use a larger patch, for example, as a compromise. Now let's adjust the exposure maybe one more time. What we can notice on this shot, our blacks are not reaching full zero. It is logical because here we have steam in the air, and this is shot on an anamorphic lens, and it's a backlit scene. So there's probably some stray light and some flare in the lens, and this is then contaminating the shadows with light. And sometimes we want to correct this flare in the image. We don't have to, so that decision is always up to us. But let's say we want to correct that. And there's a special parameter for that in BaseGrade, and it's called flare. And this is the second most important parameter in BaseGrade. So it's balance and flare. And here now I lowered flare, and what we can see on the image is, if I just reset that flare correction, it brings down the shadows and then makes the image look less foggy and less flary, I would say. And we can also use flare in the opposite direction. So let's take this little bit darker shot. So I tried to correct it up and make it really bright. So let's go all the way up, 3 stops push in exposure. And notice on the scopes that the blacks are, they look like glued to the 0% line here. And now if I zoom into the image, what we notice is that it gets really, really noisy. Here, I mean, it's kind of logical. We're pushing it 3 stops, which is a lot, but also the values here in the shadows, they are stretched very heavily. The issue here is the camera noise is pushing values below the 0 level. And linear 0 is like the foundation of the BaseGrade tool. And this is what we adjust with the flare value. So here we have values below 0, and that's why we have that really strong stretch going on in the blacks. What we can do to relax that is slowly raising the flare value. So that pushes then the values above 0. And so my recommendation is, after adjusting the balance, go then into the flare value. So now let's try to redo that shot one more time. So let's say we only push it maybe by around 1 stop up. Now we can see here our blacks are still crushed a little bit to the 0 line, and now we can give a little bit of flare in here. So flare for me personally is one of the few tools where I usually really look closely onto the scopes, because there it's usually easier to find a really nice point so that the image values are just hovering above the 0 line. I'm not saying that every shot needs to have black at almost 0, so we can also have a whole project with a very flared look, so with lifted blacks, etc., etc. That's always a creative decision, but it's always good to have the technical skills to bring an image to a solid technical foundation. One question you might have about the flare value is there a pivot point for the flare? So how do we fine adjust that thing? And the short answer is no, there is no pivot point. Flare is also a physical property, and so we are modeling what happens in the real world when light is contaminating the image. So when there is stray light, for example, in an optical system. And so there's only one way of doing that. So it's basically adding and subtracting light to the image, and this is what we're also doing with flare. And let's see how it works on another example. So here we have a shot where we're happy with our grade, and now we're going to the next shot here. So first we need to match these two shots. There's a lot of things going on here, like flare elements from the lens hitting the faces. So we could use, for example, that lampshade here on the back for a pick and match thing, because I noticed it's also visible here. And now let's examine that shot here, because here we have that moment when the bright window comes close to the edge of the frame, that a lot of that light is now raising the flare in the image. So here we can see the lifted blacks. And so this is now something that we could try to correct here. And again, notice how well it takes out that flare of the from the image. But one thing we need to look out for is that now if we move further into the shot and we have not so much flare anymore, because now her face is blocking the strong backlight. So this is something that we need to avoid at all costs. I mean, it looks super ugly, and that's very clear. But what could happen is that we pull down the values in one layer, and then because Baselight is a floating point system, we are then recovering them in a downstream operation and going back to a normal image. Still, I highly discourage you from doing these kind of things, because when the values are below 0, many things don't work as clean and as nicely as if the values are above 0. There can be nasty things happening to your images then in between this range when a lot of pixels are in the negative range. So always watch out when you have negative flare values here and you're then copy pasting from one shot to the next shot. Okay, let's move on. So far we only talked about balance and flare, and I hope I made it really clear that these two are the bread and butter of colorists, especially for the initial shot matching. So in my grading style, I always do balance and flare as one of the very first operations on every image to bring them into a nice range exposure and white balance wise. And then from there on, I use then other parameters within BaseGrade or other tools. So let's have a look at the other parameters here in BaseGrade. One that we have is a contrast, and as the name suggests, when we increase the contrast, the image gets more contrasty as expected. So that means the highlights are getting brighter and the shadows are getting darker. On a shot like this, when I now push a lot of contrast into the image, we now see that, for example, here the shadows have a tendency to get more crushed, and maybe we would like to push the added contrast more into the highlights than into the shadows. So we can redistribute the added contrast here in the image. And this is what we do with the contrast pivot. So the pivot is the point in the tonal range that is not affected by the contrast operation. So it stays at the same brightness values, and everything brighter than the contrast pivot gets pushed brighter and everything darker is made darker. So when we look at that graph here, that line, we can see that the contrast is the steepness of the line. So reducing contrast makes the line flat. That's also, we also call the image then, I guess, a little bit flat. And if we increase the contrast, then the line gets more steep. And so if we now want to push more of the added contrast into the highlights, the only thing I need to do is take the contrast pivot and move it downwards. And then notice on the image how we now redistribute the added contrast more into the highlights, for example. And the opposite obviously happens if I go the opposite direction. And the same thing happens if we go to the lower contrast side. So if we reduce contrast in the image, so then darker pixels will get brighter and bright pixels will get darker, and the contrast pivot again is the pivot point for that operation. One thing special about the contrast tool in BaseGrade compared to other contrast tools is that it's working achromatic. So let's get a chromaticity plot in here. So now notice how the chromaticity values here stay very constant and very stable when I'm adding and removing a lot of contrast on the image. And because low contrast images usually don't have such a strong chromatic component, the image looks, or at least feels to us, then more saturated if we take out a lot of contrast from the image. And in contrast, if we add more contrast, the image feels a bit desaturated. So it gets that bleach bypass look, I would say, if we add a lot of contrast with the BaseGrade contrast. Let's move on to the saturation tool. As the name suggests, it adds more colorfulness to the image, and in comparison to other saturation algorithms within Baselight, for example in BaseGrade or FilmLight, it works in a perceptually uniform color space. So you should expect a little bit more natural results using the saturation inside BaseGrade, or at least you should be aware of that the results are different using BaseGrade saturation for adding saturation and reducing it compared to other saturation algorithms in the software. And now that I mentioned the perceptual uniform color space that lies under the hood of BaseGrade, it is also worth mentioning that BaseGrade is a color space aware tool. What does that mean? So let's do another strong correction here. So we have our white balance and exposure correction here on that image. And now we also add a lot of saturation here. And here we can see the color space journey. So currently we're working in the T-log eGAM, the working color space. And now watch the scopes and the image when I change the working color space of our project. So I could set this to ACCCT. So now we're working in ACCCT, or to log C white gamut, or to 3G10 log. And what you should notice is that the image stays 100% identical. And this is one of the features of BaseGrade, because BaseGrade converts the image under the hood in its own optimized color space that it's operating in. And BaseGrade then hands over the image to the next operator, for example, in the working color space. Color space aware tools require accurate color space tagging of both your input images and your viewing color space. If the images are tagged incorrectly, BaseGrade will probably respond in a weird way. Okay, finally, let's have a look at these zones here that we have on the left and right: dim and light, dark and bright. But so far, I hope I made it very clear that balance is your way to go. So if you're used to move the left and right hand to the left and right trackball on the panel when you start working on a new shot, try to break that habit and just move one hand to the center ring and trackball. So don't start with the zones on an image. I personally even go so far that in my first layer I usually limit myself to just balance and flare. And then if I do other parameters on the shot, I then do that in a second layer. And when I go into the zones, I always definitely use a dedicated BaseGrade operator or even a new layer. Okay, on that shot here, what do we want to do? So probably we want to maybe lower the exposure a little bit to give us a nicer contrast here in that backlit scene. Maybe I increase a little bit the saturation here on that shot. But one thing that is a little bit disturbing is that we don't see as much texture and definition here in these bright tiles on the floor. And so this is something that we can try to improve with the zones. So here we have the light zone, and the light zone are basically the broad highlights of the image. So if I touch that, and if you notice what is happening on the imagery, you can see it's affecting most of the highlights of the shot, but it's not touching anything here in the shadow area. So there's a strict separation, and that is based on the pivot point here. So the pivot point is also defined in stops, and the center point for the zones is middle gray. So 0 means 18% middle gray, and the pivot point of the light zone at -1 means the light zone slowly starts kicking in one stop below middle gray, and then it's facing upwards. The dim zone is the opposite. So it faces downwards. So it affects everything in the shadows below the pivot point. Here you can notice when I play with that zone that the majority of the shadows in the image move with it. And so the dim zone per default has a pivot point of 1, so that means it starts one stop above middle gray, so 2 stops above the pivot point of the light zone, so there's some overlap here of 2 stops, and then it faces downwards. But I have to make clear that the pivot points is really where the zone very slowly kicks in. So there's a transition phase, and that transition phase is defined by the fall off. So that's that F thing here. So that this is the fall off of the zone, and this is basically telling us, so let's do a strong correction here. Now watch that line. If I set the fall off to 0, we can see that now the zone kicks in very quickly and very heavily, and if I increase the fall off, we can see now it moves in the zone much more smoothly and much more natural. So typically we want to work with larger fall offs to have a more natural result on the image, but also when we have a really large fall off and 1 is the maximum, then also our zone has a smaller effect on the image. So this is something that can be helpful if we do a correction in a zone and we think the correction in the zone is too heavy, then sometimes it can just help increasing a little bit the fall off. So let's reset everything here. So this is dim and light. So what is dark and bright? Light and bright are basically similar zones. The only differences are pivot and fall off. But bright is also a zone that faces towards the highlights. It just has a higher pivot point. So instead of 1 stop below middle gray, it starts to kick in at 2 stops above middle gray. So it starts at 3 stops brighter. And then in contrast, the fall off then is a little bit smaller, so it kicks in a little bit faster than the light zone. So if we have a look here on that curve, we can see it starts way more up here in the highlights, but then it's a little bit more responsive to our corrections here on in the curve. And the same is true with dark. Instead of 1 stop above middle gray, the dark zone starts 1 stop below middle gray and then also has a sharper fall off with 0.5. The last parameter here in the zones is the S, and that's the saturation. And this is also very nice. So we can add and reduce saturation inside each of the zones. So, okay, coming back to our shot here, what do we want to do? We want to gain a little bit more on texture here in these bright areas. So what I would try is lowering the light zone. And my advice here is don't overdo it with the zones. So it can lead to, if we do it really strong, for example, here going down 3 stops, it can then have that little bit like dull look, and so it can lead to some kind of artificial look in images if you overdo it. So work more on the range of maybe going to 1 or 2 stops in exposure correction. But with the white balance, you can do stronger corrections here. And so we're lowering that, and then maybe also increase a little bit the saturation here. And so now hopefully, if I just reset that light zone, we can see it has some kind of nice effect. But now I made a mistake. I said in the beginning that I always do the zone work in a separate layer, so I should be a good example here. So now I create a new layer, and now let's do the light thing only in that one. So we lower it maybe a little bit more than a stop, something like this, and then increase the saturation. And what we could try on top of that is going to the bright zone, so only the very brightest highlights, and then tinting them even a little bit warmer to give that a little bit more warmer feel there in the highlights. So now we have everything isolated in that zone in a separate layer, and we can see here it has some kind of effect on the image. So I zoom in a little bit so you can see it maybe a little bit nicer. Let's move on to the next shot. On this shot we had already a look before, so here we know that we need to raise the flare value a little bit, and what we could try here is just to give us a little bit more definition in the shadows. So what I could try here is going to the dim zone and then lifting up the dim zone. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I guess I would not go higher than a stop here. So lifting up the dim zone by one stop, and then also we already raised the flare a little bit, and then I also raised the overall balance by half a stop. And so now we can see a lot more into the shadows and still maintained a natural look on the image, and also not pushing up the noise too strongly here on that shot. On this shot here, let's first set our overall balance. So I would say we take it down by at least a stop. So I want to have again that nice contrasty backlit character in the shot, maybe something like this. And so now what else do we want to do on that shot? I create a new layer because now I go into the zones. Here we can see in the highlights we have that not so optimal clipping. So here the color channels of the camera are already starting to clip. So we have that hue skewed from orange towards yellow, which is not natural here. So I can try to counter that maybe with the bright zone. So what I could do is desaturate in the zone and then also tint it into a more uniform color. What we need to be aware of is that the saturation is performed after the color balance in a zone. So if I pull the saturation all the way down to 0, then we will end up with a colorless zone. So the saturation is applied after the white balance in the zone. So in that case, we shouldn't go all the way down. That's also something that I would usually try to avoid. I would never go in a zone with the saturation all the way down to full 0. If we go with the saturation to 0, that's then a really like a destructive process. So there's no way to invert a saturation operation that goes to 0. And that's usually then something that I'm a little bit careful with. So let's go here maybe to something like that, and then tint it more warmly, and also we could try to make it a little bit brighter. So this is something now here for that highlight zone to clean that up a little bit. Another thing we could do on that shot is go into the color of the clouds, and so they are sitting nicely here in the dim zone. So if I move the dim zone towards blue, we can see we have a nice effect on the clouds and a nicer color separation here. Again, notice how the legs of the climber are not super blue contaminated because we're working in a physically based tool. Now we're losing a little bit the climber in the shot. It's a little bit maybe too silhouette-y, and the good thing is that the climber is living here in the dark zone, so we can lift that up just a little bit. Also maybe give the saturation a small push here in the climber. And so now all of our zone work is now here happening in layer 2. So let's just bypass this, and we can see there's quite something that we did, and the overall correction, also the global balance combined, gives us this result. Moving on, in this shot here, we would probably also first go down just a little bit with the global exposure in the balance. Then I add a new layer. So here the task could be to enhance a little bit the definition in the sky. So currently it's a little bit compressed here. So it's compressed by the display rendering transform. So what we could do here is again lowering the light zone. And yeah, maybe also adding a little bit more saturation there. And so now I'm doing the light zone a little bit stronger. And what we can see is that yeah, we get more color and a little bit more definition there in the sky, but we're also affecting here the bright areas of the cows. So the zone is also affecting here our foreground, which is the natural behavior because typically tonal ranges overlap and the zones have a smooth transition. But on a shot like this, where the tonal ranges, for example, here of the sky, which is this hill here on the top of our histogram, and the foreground, which is that bottom hill here on the histogram, they have a clear valley between them. So they're really nicely separated. So what we can try here is adjusting the pivot point of our light zone, and then also on a shot like this where we don't have many pixels in between the sky and the darker areas, we can then also try using a sharper fall off, so a smaller fall off number. I would never go all the way down to 0, but let's use a much smaller fall off here for illustration purposes. And now I'm moving the light's pivot through the image, and notice how it affects the different areas and how when we affect the foreground, how it makes it look in a weird way flat. But so the thing here is that we would move the pivot just above the bottom hill here so that it can start to kick in here in that valley, and then it has a stronger effect than here on the highlight. I need to move the dim pivot here out of the way. So here we can see the light pivot again working on the image, and so the sweet spot here is just above our bottom hill here and going into that valley. But on most images we don't have that nice valley here in between the zones, so there we have tonal ranges overlapping each other, and then it's usually better working with larger fall-offs. So now here we have that effect, and now we could try to stretch out the sky a little bit more into the peak highlights. So what I can do is raise the bright zone a lot, and then play with the brights pivot until we have a nice result here. And this then gives us a nice extra push on the bright areas of the clouds. Yeah, maybe something like that. And so now let's bypass that layer, and we can see, yeah, so we definitely enhanced the definition and the visibility of the sky here. I want to share one more piece of advice about working with the zones. So if you prefer an even softer response between dim and light, one technique that can be helpful is going to the extremes regarding softness. So for the dim zone, move it all the way up to pivot to 4 stops above middle gray and the fall off to 1. And with the light zone, we do the opposite. We go all the way down to -4 and also the fall off to 1. So now we have these two zones at a maximum overlap between each other. And so now if you work with, for example, color tints in these zones, they now have a really smooth overlap between each other, and they're not responding like a lift and gain, for example, but it goes more into that direction. So that is also a technique worth investigating on your end. So now I come to the closing pieces of advice. One is check out the customize menu that we have in BaseGrade and most other operators. So there you can do really fine adjustments to your personal preferences. For example, rotate the color wheels or create new pages with a custom layout of the tools on the panel. And another thing that I want to mention is that BaseGrade can be controlled via bumps. So this is similar to printer lights, but in the BaseGrade world. So you need to have numeric keypad mode set to grading, and then you can use the numeric keypad on your computer keyboard to do these bump style corrections. For example, here I can go up in 1/10 of a stop in exposure and down, or do white balance corrections in defined steps on the image. To learn more about the bumps, my advice is to check out the release history and search for BaseGrade bumps. You will find then a description of how these bumps work in BaseGrade. Okay, that's what I wanted to show today. So yeah, that was a lot of stuff. And let me check the questions. So I will go through them, I guess, in reverse order. Yeah, so there was one about the difference of dim and light and dark and bright, but I guess I covered that. So they're basically similar. It's just a different default pivot and fall off, but they can be made identical. And yeah, there's some love for Baselight, and that's, I guess, what we all share, or at least I hope. Yeah, and one question here I see is about looks. So can BaseGrade be used to create looks? And I would say that the biggest strength of BaseGrade is the shot-by-shot matching, because it's a physically based tool, as I said. We can really, it's much more powerful to match different lighting conditions from one shot to another shot. So if there's a slight exposure difference between two shots, that's an easy task usually for BaseGrade. But also it can be used to create certain looks. I mean, that one technique that I showed at the end with the very soft pivot and fall off overlaps. So that's a technique I would say that's more into creating looks. So then you can add like different tones to the highlights and shadows, for example. And the other thing that I also showed was the, for example, adding contrast with BaseGrade. That then gives that, I always call it the more like bleach bypass style look to an image. So this is another example. And then obviously just, also obviously also just changing the white balance on a shot sometimes can even have a kind of like a look effect. But for me, yeah, that's then more the more technical shot matching side of things. All right. So yeah, so I hope it was informative. So Bob, anything to add from your side?
Yeah, there was one other question, and I'm not entirely sure whether I answered exactly the right question. It was about the pick mode. So when you want to enable pick, you do have to click on the button. But once you've made a pick, then the matching function is automatically available as long as there's a color that you've picked. There isn't a keyboard shortcut though to enable the pick button. You do have to click on that with the mouse. But it's as I said, it's something that you do once, and then you would then you have saved that color as a reference. So hopefully that would clear up any confusion over that.
And another thing worth mentioning is, because we can't demo it here in that on a single computer, is that if you're working with a dedicated video output screen, once you hit the pick button, the mouse automatically moves over to the image screen. So that's also a nice convenient thing for that pick and match thing. But yeah, but I just want to make clear one more time that if you have a real panel in front of you with a trackball for the balance, I guess in many cases you are faster just using ring and trackball. At least that's the case for me. But when I'm on a computer without a panel, then that pick and match is a very handy tool, I think. And also sometimes if you do some more technical matching, maybe for VFX grades, etc., etc. I think let's wrap it up for today. And I hope, yeah, everyone learned a little bit. And then see you all next time. Thanks for watching.
Great. Thanks, Andy. See you
Bye-bye.
next week. Bye.